and welcome to Dominant, the Souness and Smith years. I'm Martyn Ramsey, your host as always, and this week we are here to run the rule over the end and the close of the 1987-88 season. Troubled, turbulent, but no less interesting. And to do that, I'm joined as ever, but we do a good rotation on this show. And David Edgar is with me this week. How are you doing, David?
I'm good, thank you, Martyn. Nice to be here. I always enjoy doing this show.
And with David is Alan Bradley. How are you doing, Alan?
Yep, same here, Martyn. Yeah, really good. Looking forward to the show. Always love kind of talking to you guys about Rangers. Again, not my favourite season, but we'll get to it. But as you say, some real interesting stuff to cover. Yeah,
it is interesting, and yeah, it's not going to be full of joy, this show. I don't think there's much in the way to really celebrate the last time that the three of us were together. There were at least three incredible games to kind of run the rule over and maybe enjoy again. We're going to start in Europe because that's kind of where we are now, and the return of European competition. Graham Souness' first assault at the European Cup as a manager, a competition, of course, that he had made so famous as a player. And he was doing all right, chaps. We were in the quarterfinals where we play Steaua Bucharest. Again, Rangers been sent behind the Iron Curtain. Steaua had won the European Cup in 1986, beating Barcelona in penalties, one of the worst penalty competitions, I think, in history. And they were, 3 domestic titles in a row, very strong side. They'd already added one of the most promising young players in Europe, a Mr. Georgi Hagi. Real Madrid and Bayern Munich with the really 2 super clubs left, and they were paired together. Benfica might have been a more daunting prospect than Steaua, but Anderlecht, Bordeaux, PSV, the others left in the competition. We'll get to the game and all of that. Can you remember the draw? I mean, it's getting so familiar, this trip that far east, David.
Yeah, I remember the draw again, coming in from school to see it on Scotland Today. This might sound really odd, given these days of several dozen, by the looks of it, 24/7 sports channels. But back then, you know, you really, if you were a sport obsessed wee boy like I was, you sort of had to get it where you could get it. And you know, the news reports at night on Scottish TV were unmissable for me, because you would get, you know, your latest Rangers news. Steaua were a team that I remembered from possibly the worst cup final I've ever seen in my life, which is Barcelona versus Steaua in the 1986 European Cup final, which was an awful, you'll remember this as well, I'm sure, Alan, an awful 2 hours of football with no chances whatsoever, followed by a penalty shootout where the Barcelona players still couldn't score. I think Steaua won 2-0, but you know, after the full 10 penalties. So I knew that they were good, because you know, clearly it's the side that won the European Cup a couple of years before. And Lakatush was the star name. I think he was the guy that, you know, you'd seen in the Romania side. Romania had played England in the qualifiers and Northern Ireland in the qualifiers for the 86 World Cup, Martyn. So we'd seen a little bit of them. I mean, by seeing all of them amounted to highlights on Midweek Sports Special, but you know, you had seen them and they were highly rated. Obviously, they had Hagi coming through, but a lot of the Steaua players made up the majority of that side. It wasn't glamorous. I don't think you could say that it was a tie that you thought. There are certain teams in Europe, I would liken it in the modern day to maybe drawing Sevilla in the Europa League, that it's not glamorous enough to make up for how good they are. It's one of these ties that it's difficult to get that excited about, because for whatever reason they're not a huge name, or you can get a tie where the travel's bad, but you know the side is really, really good. And that's kind of what we felt with this. You know, again, the travel's going to be a pain in the neck. The time of the kickoff is going to be a pain in the neck. It's going to happen through the day. The leg in Romania was going to be, it was live on STV, but it was during the day, and again I had to rely on the kindliness of my headmaster at school to let us watch it. my headmaster at primary school was a genius, a man I've spoken about on other shows called Mr. Campbell, who I love very much, but he used it as a behavioural thing, that, you know, only kids that had behaved particularly well in the week. I've never been nicer.
In the run up to this,
in the run up to be able to watch the game. But yeah, look, it was a draw. You pull at some teams and it gets the juices flowing, and you pull at other teams and you go, oh, that's a tough one. And I think Stoya were category 2 there.
Alan, any thoughts on the draw when it was made? This is before Christmas, of course. The draw for the quarterfinals. So it's a long wait until the games actually takes place.
Yeah, I mean, the same. I mean, you knew, obviously, because of what they'd done previously, you knew they were going to be really efficient as well. And again, it was that old going behind the kind of iron curtain was the worry. I think because of what we had done in the previous round, obviously going through, it did still give us that wee bit of confidence, And as David said, they didn't really have that same kind of history, as some of the other clubs. So it was a wee bit of going to be difficult over there. They're going to be really organised. And again, we knew about some of these cracking players, but it's going to be away from home first again. Let's see what we can do over there, try and keep things tight. And then we've got the chance at Ibrox. So, yeah, I mean, really that was about all. Like David just picked up the draw, kind of later on. And fortunately, I think it was my post office counters days, we used to get like a kind of half day. Mine's happily happened to be in the Wednesday. It wasn't a case of sooking in with the teacher, but I think the branch manager, Davey, kind of, was doing the staffing the week before. So I managed to get that one, yeah.
Alan, that day when the post office closed early was referred to as half shut day. And on a day where it was a bank holiday, just in wonderful co-winning logic, it was referred to as a half shut day all day.
At the obviously counter, we were still kind of open on the Wednesday, but as I say, I'd managed to kind of manoeuvre things, and fortunately at that time as well, I think the majority of staff at counters, you probably maybe 12 or 14, like 2 guys, and the rest, the Solasses who quite frankly, they weren't really going to watch the Rangers game anyway. Yeah.
Okay, so the Rangers team that had beaten Dynamo Kiev, they'd sailed past Gornik, I think might have fancied Stoya, as tough as that was for the reasons you mentioned, but as we know, this wasn't the same Rangers side at all. We're in a different proposition by the time March 1988 arrived. Ray Wilkins had been signed in time and Richard Gough would make it, but this batch of new recruits, Walters, Brown, Bartram, Ian Ferguson, they'd have to wait to a possible semi-final, and Butcher was obviously missing. He would watch the Ibrox game in a Pebble Mill TV studio because he was down in Lilleshall doing his recovery. And then 3 weeks before the first leg in Romania on March the 3rd, the major worry about Souness's winter market trading was kind of realised. After 40 goals in 128 consecutive appearances, the Rangers' reliance on Ali McCoist took its toll. He suffered a knee injury, ruled him out of a 4-0 home win over St Mirren, and then that cup exit in the Scottish Cup at East End Park to Dunfermline that we discussed last week. When that recovery didn't happen as hoped, McCoist was put under the knife. This was on Tuesday 23rd of February, just over a week before the first leg, and then off to Lilleshall, where every Rangers player seemed to go for the best rehabilitation possible. It was microscopic keyhole surgery, revolutionary in 1988. And instead of just removing the cartilage from the knee, they simply trimmed off the parts that were causing problem. So there was a faint hope that McCoist might be able to make that comeback on the second leg, which would be 16th of March. But he'd travel to Romania anyway, purely for morale. Well, not as it turned out. Even as the team sheets were shared before the game, the Stoya manager, Angel Iordanescu, he thought there'd been a mistake. They, like everyone else, kind of assumed that McCoist had as much chance of playing as those who were not registered in time. But there he was, the irrepressible talisman, taking his place as the lone striker, which is a job that requires a lot of physical effort, more than a little bit of bravery, given the kind of close attention of Romanian defenders. 8 days after going under the knife. Ali's performance in Bucharest was a valiant one. He took his knocks, he would work hard to press the Romanians back, but there was a kind of understandable sharpness missing, especially with the one decent chance that was passed up halfway through the first half. Brilliant work by Cooper, Wilkins and Souness, sent him into space, but he just lacked again that bit of sharpness. Some of the damage, of course, by that time had been done. Okay, before we get into the nuts and bolts of this game, this was played in the afternoon, midweek. In the Christmas of 1987, I'd got a transistor radio, battery powered, and
Nice.
It was quite small. And I thought, like some kind of super spy, I would be able to take this in to class and somehow, with a 2 o'clock kickoff, get away with it. It was confiscated before lunchtime, I think. The teachers were well aware of what I had in mind. There was no Mr. Campbell rolling out the TV on the wee tray.
Yes, it was on the TV on the thing, on the casters.
Oh, that's right. They used,
Yeah.
That's right,
So I missed the damage. So you saw it then, David?
Yes, I did.
Um,
The flesh. This season, do you ever have one of those weeks where it just seems to go on forever, and then you look at your phone and it's Wednesday? This was a season, and this was another example of it. That Ali getting injured then, and immediately that was what the talk was he's going to miss this game, this huge game. And because of the way Romania was back then, Martyn, they actually did have spies, in inverted commas, at the airport, and he was limping, and he was, the rest of them were dressed one way, he was dressed another. There was a bit of kidology went on there, and of course it leads to the argument between Souness and McNee on the plane, which I'm sure you're going to come to. When Souness threatened to punch him, and as I've said before, you should never threaten to punch Gary McNee. That's one I'll get away with if it looks all right in a transcript. He wasn't fit. He couldn't be fit. It's just not possible. And he was valiant's a great word for it. Valiant is a great word. He gave us what he had. It's just what he had wasn't an awful lot. It was a bizarre decision to sell basically all the strikers and rely on one for a team that played with two anyway. That was a strange thing, but we didn't have anything at all that was allowed to come in. And you mentioned those names; these are really good players, Cooper, Walters, etc. But there was a raggedness to Rangers in the second half of this season. Quite often there was a raggedness to our transfer dealings. There was a raggedness to Souness, where we just seem to be, going game to game, month to month, really. Now, we know that Souness was actually putting in building blocks, but at the time it didn't feel that way. The Romanians were incredibly well organised. You mentioned there Iordanescu, who's a legend of, that region, really. And understandably so, for what his achievements were. They all knew their job. They all knew what they were doing. And, Stoya were the team formed out of the army. And you could tell because they had a rigid tactical shape. And again, something that I think, and this is the whole of British football, and I include England in this, that the European sides were much better at. A team from Romania, incidentally, to win the European Cup has got to be dogged. They understood things like shape and space better than we did. They were much better at playing percentages than we were. And Rangers found it really difficult to break down this very disciplined side that, were very tight, very compact. You could actually probably mark out on a map afterwards, Martyn, where all the players played, because they all had their area that they occupied, and they stuck to them. And what they did was they did have some real explosive talent up front. They did, and they knew that they would create something, and they did. And again, without the away goal, I kind of feared the worst. Even as a wee boy, I sort of felt we'd done really well against Kiev, of course, but it was 1-0. I think when it was to 2, again, I remember my dad saying, "Aye, but if they score one, we need 4."
Yeah.
And
well, this is
I defy anybody in Europe honestly, anybody in Europe at that time to get 4 against this Stoya side.
Well, this was the thing. It was a sunny day, if you remember, in Bucharest, but the night before the weather had been utterly horrendous, and the pitch was in a bit of doubt. There were 2 army helicopters hovering over the pitch to dry it out. That's the standard of technology we're talking about here.
So it was helicopter Wednesday.
Helicopter Wednesday, hi. But what it did was create a mud bath, especially in the penalty box, and that's really where the first goal comes from. Stoya had pressed Rangers in from the kickoff, and they had a few opportunities. Rangers just couldn't clear the lines, and the last attempt by Goff kind of weakly held up on that muddy floor before being absolutely rattled home by Victor Petruka. 2 minutes in. But Rangers rode it out quite well. Woods was superb. Rangers shape, again, the 4-5-1 thing that had worked in Kiev to a degree and Poland was doing a similar kind of job here. And as you mentioned, David, 1-0's fine, because like Kiev, Stoya's away record's terrible. So 1-0's not bad. And 66th minute, a deflected free kick, wicked deflection off Davy Cooper past Woods, after Goff was kind of thrown to the ground from the Rangers wall. I mean, absolutely ridiculous scenes going on there. And it was... For all the planning and that there are, we'll get into the kind of wider moments that maybe been missed here. But it was desperately bad luck. When Rangers looked like they were doing the kind of containing job that they'd done before, Alan, you taking that time off to watch, or you Sky somehow to watch it. Can you remember that second goal and the difference that makes from 1-0, because we'd been there with Kiev, to 2-0, and we don't look like scoring a consolation?
I could. A couple of things just to say first. When Ali McCoy went under the knife in the hospital Tuesday 23rd of February, I was in hospital. My daughter was born, so I sort of remember. So it was a magical day for both. But what you were saying as well with the keyhole surgery, I hadn't heard that, because normally you were thinking months, with that injury.
Aye.
So that seemed to be the big thing. But you're right, at the game, and stupidly as well, Martyn, I still remember thinking, Souness, how Liverpool used to go away, just shut up shop and, either win 1-0 or get close. And I remember foolishly getting into that second half and thinking, we're going to do okay here. We're going to go back with one. And as you say, when that second one went in, it was just horrendous. We had done, especially from 2 minutes out, we had done so well, up to that stage. So it was a real blow, in that one. Again, I still had, I don't know, I think my heart had a let's go back to Ibrox under the floodlights, do what we can do. But I think, as David said as well, 2-0, do you know what I mean? I don't think many teams kind of tended to overturn a 2-0 deficit second leg.
No.
Certainly not against a team, as you say.
European Cup winners.
2 seasons.
European Cup winners.
Exactly, the experience, and as David said as well, the way they were so organised. You talk about the army, and as you say, everyone seemed to know their place and so on. So it was going to be a hang of a challenge, coming back over to Ibrox.
I think that this is something that I think is coming through in this show, and I'm delighted to it, because it's sparked me thinking as well, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners, about our approach to European football in this period. Not merely the performances and sometimes lack of, but the way that we went about it. And it's pretty clear to me that this is a 1970s approach.
It's the Willie Waddle, it's the big Willie Johnson up front, and everyone else. You're right, David, yeah.
And also even the Souness thing is what he knew at Liverpool. And I'm not sure by this stage that it was particularly applicable, because these sides were being coached in a different way. And these sides were being coached by guys who were innovators and would go to, countries that were less frightened of, players from out with their nation. I'm thinking about Italy in particular, Martyn, you'll recall. They would hire coaches from Eastern Europe. They would hire coaches from Portugal. And then in Sweden, Eriksson, of course, has come through at this point at Gothenburg, Sven-Göran Eriksson. And I think that we were clinging to things that had worked. And as Alan said, we believed they did. And at 1-0, but even at 1-0, we got away with it against Kiev, and we did. Fantastic performance. But
things had moved on, hadn't they?
Things had moved on. We didn't realise that these teams all thought 1-0 was brilliant because they were like, right, we'll score one over there and then we'll sit in and we'll defend for our lives. And that was the difference. And again, they were much better organised than most Scottish sides that we'd come up against. Well, how many of these games do you remember, especially when we go back and watch them? There's a harem scarum element to them, There's a kind of who can win the fight to take possession of the ball element to it, and we were playing, I think, a different. And then when we went into Europe in the 90s, again, playing the three at the back that the Italians had given up, 6-7 years before, I just feel we were always that little bit behind what the rest of Europe was doing.
David, it's as if we were getting movies from people that 4 years ago were probably top of the charts. Do you know what I mean?
It's talking points of shows that were buzzworthy 5 years ago. I just tend to, and I hadn't realised this, Martyn, until I started doing and listening to this show, that I just feel that our ideas, because we have players, I don't believe the quality gap is anywhere near. But I look at us and I kind of think, now the counter argument to that is, well, Dundee United reached the European final and Aberdeen, of course, won a European trophy. And those are legit, but again, I think the way that we approached it, and Celtic were murder for this, of just going all guns blazing at home, losing away goals, and really, it's just a mentality thing. And I just think that Scottish football as a whole, British football, to be honest, because it took the English to people.
Well, this is the thing. Yeah, I mean, John had made a point. Yeah, John had made a point a few weeks ago that where we are now, this 1987-88, there's this kind of 3-season interregnum between the English way, which had, as we know, dominated, especially the European Cup, some of the other competitions as well for so long. Heysel puts an end to that. We're not quite at the Serie A domination yet. That's going to come 88-89 with Milan's first. So you have these few years where you get Stoya winning European Cup, then Porto, and PSV, as it would turn out this season, where things are up in the air, but they're changing. We'll talk a lot as the show goes on and the weeks go on about Souness in Europe, because in a couple of seasons I want to really focus on this, because he says a few things that tell me that he gets it. He understands what's changing, but I'm not sure he's able to follow through on what he sees. And the Liverpool thing understandably dominates his thoughts. How successful has he been with this team and this ethos? And a very much we don't really bother about the opposition. And that's fine at Liverpool, because the opposition are scared of Liverpool, or were scared of Liverpool. They weren't scared of Rangers. And you had to bother about the opposition. And I don't think away from home is incredibly naive. I know what you mean, David, the lack of this away goal so often. In Mönchengladbach, Kiev didn't matter, but 1-0's all right. Here would be a problem. It's a 4-5-1. It's smother it and just kind of get out of dodge. So it's not completely naive, but it's probably missing that there's been a change. How we get to that change is going to be the crux of the Rangers story in Europe throughout this era. Fair to say the playing home was tense, David. You referenced that before. The Scottish media had been completely unaware that McCoist had actually passed the fitness test. And there was an English journalist who just turned up. Just one of these things, coincidence, happenstance, serendipity, we'll call it what you like. But he had seen McCoist pass his fitness test, and he'd got the exclusive. And Jeremy McNee of the Daily Express at the time, complaining vehemently in the plane home. That's when the Rangers team shared the plane with the press pack, of course. And and Souness, according to Ian Durant, eyes bulging, shouting, "Don't you ever fucking speak to me like that again," and was very close to a physical encounter on that flight home from Romania. Again, another example of just how chaotic this season was. Despite that, Souness and Roberts and McCoy provided that kind of usual frontier gibberish in the press about the second leg, and in doing so, I speak to my dad at the time and for the last 30 odd years about this. Pre-match, he says Ibrox was incredible that night, because it had to be. A wee bit, we record this not long after the Dortmund game, which we all expected was going to be an incredible night. It turned out that way, but we get into that game with a lead, not really sure how we're supposed to play, what's supposed to happen here. Sometimes the best European nights, like Kiev, that followed through the whole game, the Stoya game and AEK Athens, another one where you need to be massive right from the off, and it's kind of spine tingling. But the energy levels were unplugged by yet another sting from just a more experienced Canier side. Stoica was involved, but the finish by Marius Lakatos was sublime. But that Rangers defence, that Rangers central defensive partnership, again, of Gough and Roberts, an utter shambles. Mm-hmm. They would be complaining to each other. I think there was a fight at half-time about whose man it was. Again, communication just appalling. And that's fatal, 3-0. Rangers do respond. Gough scores, ironically, from a Roberts flick in 16 minutes. McCoy buries a penalty. 2-1, theoretically it's on, but you've said, David, 4-1 is going to be pretty unlikely. The Graham Souness controlling the ball not in question. He directed a lot of this counter pressure, but his control or lack of control off it was again in question this time. The tackle, a scandalous assault on Rotario. Probably the best remembered incident from the whole match now. Souness is lucky to escape with a booking, and that incredible gesture of innocence when he points to his ruffled sock, perhaps making all the difference.
I had seen that before, Martyn.
Yeah, against Stoya.
Yeah, but even before with Souness, before he came to Rangers.
Yeah, it was for Liverpool against Stoya, sure.
Sorry, when he went over to Sampdoria.
Oh, right.
And he went to this game very quickly. Crowd, like your dad had said, was just like Kiev to start with. It then became a bit like Leeds, as you say, with that ridiculous goal early on. But we did rally. And during that first half, obviously we scored a couple of goals, but we battered them. But the Souness one, I remember he just moved, and it was Saints and Greavesy, I think, David, you'll remember, on the Saturday afternoon. Yep. And what they'd done is they said, Graham Souness is going over there to Sampdoria now. Let's have a wee look at this clip. And it was one of the Italian, the opposition. And the guy sort of done Souness, and it was maybe 13 minutes or whatever it would be. And they were laughing, and they said, let's have a wee look at it now in 20 whatever minutes. And Souness basically just went in like that, Martyn. And the very same thing as well, gave it the old pointing to his sock, and that's because, to the referee. And again, he managed to get off. But it was very similar to the one against Wales and the one later on against Iceland. Yeah. Automatically should just have been off the park, yeah?
We are hypocrites as football fans. Because we lionise when one of our players does this, particularly if it's against somebody we don't like. And we are understandably appalled when someone does it to one of our players, and it's a fair accusation of hypocrisy. It's a horrible tackle. I mean, it's not a tackle. Let's be honest. It's a stamp.
It's an assault.
He's trying to hurt the guy, and he succeeds in doing so. And you're right there. I mean, you mentioned there Siggy Jonsson was the Iceland player. And his career was never the same afterwards. He was, one of the brightest prospects in Europe. I don't think you can make a case for Souness on this one. I really don't. It was frustration. It was just sheer frustration. And I think that, as I say, I've like everybody else, I hold my hands up to being a hypocrite, folks, because I've joked about this particular tackle. And maybe because it does seem, in the far-flung days, that it's easier to do that. And you say, well, football was different then, and it clearly was, because these days, Jesus, not only would you be sent off, you'd be looking at a heavy duty man.
I mean, David Martyn mentioned this, obviously the Stour one with Liverpool, and I've seen that on YouTube, and it's an off the ball, and I think he broke the boy's jaw or something. And when he was getting on off the plane to go to the return leg, all of the police over there were all pointing at Souness and so on. So
it was, he could lose his head in these matches. And again, I'm going to offer a bit of a defence here for example, the Italian one that you mentioned, because that was a part of the game. Somebody
had to. That's right. Yeah.
Every team had a hard man. The opposition hard man does him, and he does the opposition hard man in return. That was football back then, for good or for bad. Now, clearly it was for bad, and that's why it's been eliminated from the sport as much as possible, because you don't want guys hurting each other. But that one was just because we were losing. And it's a horrible tackle, and he points at his sock, as you say, and says, here you go. And as for the atmosphere that night, it was tremendous, because I think there was a sense of, right, we know what we need to do. We've done this.
David, at 2-1, I remember we were up in that Govan rear, anyway, and at 2-1 it was bouncing, and then even get into the second half, and you're thinking to yourself, and we had about 4 or 5 decent chances, yeah.
I think that, again, the fans could not be faulted for the part that they played. We'd just given ourselves far too much at that point against a side who were confident in their ability to defend, who turned up in a European Cup final to defend for 2 hours against.
And they were dangerous on the break. They were dangerous on the break to get a second.
Yeah,
but
Blackett was a player. But the goal itself, you mentioned there, I wanted to kind of bring that up and focus in on it for a bit. For whatever reason, there are things that you just do not put together, right? There are things that work really well. Fish and chips are great. Fish and pancakes, not so much. And that's Roberts and Goff. Individually, 2 good things, but they just could not play together at centre back.
Absolutely incredible. No. Rangers did have chances. Durant had a couple, and there was a glorious chance from McCoy. 18 minutes to go. A beautiful back heel by Ray Wilkins that set him up. Yeah. And he blazed over. Now, 3-1 with 18 minutes to go, with the crowd the way it was. All of a sudden, that ridiculous, far-fetched, fanciful fourth, I don't think is as such. There was a chance, but it wasn't to be. It could and it arguably should have been. The sale of Fleck and Falco, which Andy and John and I discussed last week, I don't think is relevant in the first tie, because Rangers were always going to go 4-5-1. Neither of them were going to hold the ball up particularly well. Certainly not Fleck. That lone striker, Rangers probably didn't actually have someone all that suited to it, to be honest. But supporting McCoy for a better recovery period and backfiring for the second leg might have been significant, especially if you could put Durant closer to him. But ultimately, both games were undone by those defensive issues that we mentioned, and a bit of bad luck with that second goal. PSV were going to win the European Cup that season, guys. 9 matches they played in order to win it. They won 3 of them. None of those. They didn't win a match from the quarterfinals on. Quarterfinals and semi-finals, they won in away goals, and the finals we talked about, they won in penalties. I think this, maybe even more than that famous 92-93, which we'll come to, was arguably the best opportunity Rangers had of success in the big one. Given who would come in, especially Walters, in that semi-final. These were not good teams, or huge teams, not in the Marseille-Milan potential of 92-93. And it was just another weird thing, and I'm conscious of when we're recording this, but Rangers played most of their best football this season in Europe, on a stage that seemed to suit them, maybe providing a welcome and exciting break from domestic drudgery by that point, which we just never got to grips with it that season. But it's just those defensive errors, bad luck with injuries, maybe more than the sale of Fleck and Falco cost. And again, I have to go back to the failure to land Mark Hateley that summer. what a difference that could have possibly made to this particular European campaign. I think it's an underrated missed opportunity, David.
Oh, I definitely do. I really, in fact, when I look back in the Souness time, this is the one, because we weren't always fortunate with draws, and we'll come to it in a couple of years, but we weren't getting past Red Star Belgrade, right, because they were shit hot, and that can happen. Bayern Munich, bastard of a draw. We weren't lucky with draws at all. However, this year, we weren't, lucky either, because we get Kiev, but once you get through it, if you want to win a European Cup, you've got to be capable of beating a side like Steaua Bucharest. I just feel that this season is a series, Martyn, of kind of wrong moves at every stage, really.
Yeah.
Kind of wrong decisions, and it's almost totemic of the goal that we conceded in this second leg, that it's just people not quite on each other's wavelength. There was a kind of fractured feel about what we did, and the team at times looked full of good players but no real cohesion to it. There were injuries, there were guys in and out of the side, there were guys in and out of the club. Falco's a good example of it, and the whole thing kind of just felt all the time like we were trying to get the car and it wouldn't kick out of second gear. I agree with you in terms of missed opportunities. As I say, when I look back on that period, I don't have any real regrets about Bayern Munich or about Red Star Belgrade, because cards on the table, they were better than us, and that can happen in the case of Red Star by a distance. This one, I felt that, and I look round at the teams that remain in it, and even now I think, as you say, the Kiev lineup and a full head of steam.
Yeah.
Without doubt.
I think yeah. I mean, Walter Smith mentioned it on this year, and basically he said that we should have improved the quality in terms of the first team in the squad, but we should have done that immediately in the summer. And he says, and we recognised that, and then through the season we went, right, we need to do this, we need to do that. And I think had we have taken that step of, fixing the roof when the sun was shining at that summer, and had some of these players in, definitely, Davey, I think we were definitely going to go further,
A perennial problem at Rangers, it would seem, but as we record.
Yeah.
But I think that for me, that is exactly it, Alan, what you said there of it's recognising problems, which is great, but too late. Then it's trying to fix them at an inopportune moment. And instead of just fixing the first leak, what we've done is we're trying to pin.
There's buckets everywhere, isn't there?
Aye, exactly. And that's what it felt like. It felt like a season you were firefighting. The season before, Martyn, I felt that Rangers, and the season that follows it, I think Rangers, I felt that we were leading. I felt like we were, we knew who we were, we knew what we were doing, and we knew what we wanted to do.
We had a strategy and a kind of vision, and we were...
Absolutely. On the park, off the park, and you got the impression that we were going, and, we might not get there, of course, but we know what we're doing, we know what we're trying to do. This season, confusion reigns. There's confusion everywhere, and that's my huge memory of this season, and it felt like that, and that kind of frustrated me because the year before, and being 10, and as you know me, Martyn, I'm still unreasonable about stuff. That's why that first year I didn't take to that new kit that I now think is one of the greatest kits we've ever had in our life. But back then I just identified it with this madness that seemed to engulf the club.
The second leg of the quarter-final that Rangers were dismissed in, even though they won 2-1, was 16th of March. On the 17th of March, there's a quote from Graham Souness in The Observer, where he says, "This is the biggest setback in my time at Rangers." He wasn't talking about the quarter-final defeat. He was talking about UEFA's new rule, or new proposed rule, to limit team selection to 4 foreign players as of the next season, which would scupper quite a lot of Souness's plans for the future, but also the players he brought in. There's so many English players that would potentially be caught in this particular ruling. In May, at the Old Course in St Andrews, this was ratified but changed, that there would be a grace period of 3 seasons, so any basically any foreign players that you had on the books for the next 3 seasons
assimilated
would be assimilated. Yeah. If you bought new ones, then fine. But Terry Butcher and Chris Woods, for example, would be fine for 3 years. But it was a huge moment in European football. We will talk about it in another show, but it happened in March 1988, and nothing outside of Rangers agency, shaped this period more than that particular decision, because ultimately the transformation, the modernisation, the horizons that were being broadened had to be narrowed. We had to be more Scottish, by definition, of an illegal rule. And the Rangers revolution turned, and possibly turned backwards, more inwards, and became more obsessed with domestic dominance rather than any continental carry-on. The weekend that followed Stoya Boys was an Old Firm game, the final, thankfully, final Old Firm game of the season. Celtic came to Ibrox on the Sunday, live on STV. Kind of billed as something of a title decider. Celtic were 4 points ahead with a game in hand anyway. 4 hours of coverage to this game, helicopter shots,
including. Do you remember the priest?
Yes, indeed.
Yes. The legendary, it was a priest who supported Rangers, and he must have lived on some island, because I remember him being on a boat. Right, because he was showing with Rangers scarf on a boat, riding in. And my grandfather was from a certain generation of men, Martyn, and he didn't say a word, but they say a look can convey 1,000 words. It most certainly did that day. 4 hours of coverage. I mean,
4 hours. Yeah, I mean, it was like an FA Cup final day. Helicopter shots of the Rangers bus leaving Turnberry, Celtic bus leaving the Erskine Hotel. Slightly different quality of surroundings, with all due respect. Celtic had effectively sealed the championship. Rangers could intensify the pressure. 8 games remaining, cutting that down. It was a tense but kind of clean Old Firm game, frenetic pace as you would imagine, but few clear-cut chances. Ian Ferguson with the best chance for Rangers, his Old Firm debut, but he missed. During the interval, Sandy Clark and Willie Miller were the studio guests, and they'd noticed this lack of aerial dominance that the Rangers had shown when defending cross balls, and in the second half this frailty was badly exposed. Paul McStay cross from the right was so badly dealt with. I mean, Graham Roberts had 2 failed attempts to clear it, that McStay could make the cross and still have time to get himself to the edge of the box to volley home and put Celtic in front. I mean, it was just ridiculous. But 7 minutes later, Rangers did similar. Jan Bartram, one of those new signings, quite a similar goal. Edge of the box, Celtic couldn't clear. A lovely volley into the corner of Bonner's net. But Rangers were tiring. Celtic squeezed in a crucial winner. Just over 10 minutes to go. Not the last time or the first time that season that Celtic would score late on to win a game. And yet again, it's that calamitous defensive disorganisation. Anton Rogan, who would have his moments of more fun as the years would go on, presented with a free header from a Tommy Burns corner, which was going wide of the target until it was deflected off the chest of an unmarked Andy Walker and close
hit him. Yeah,
it hits him. I mean, he doesn't know anything about it. As a striker, if it had been McCoy, I'd be giving it where you've got to be there, to get lucky, I suppose. But it just felt grimly inevitable that day. This game I just remember as grim because it was overcast, the weather was bad. It was a turgid game of football, as you mentioned, Martyn, which suited Celtic. They didn't need it to be anything else. And Rangers, everything seemed a chore. Everything that we did this season seemed a bloody chore, with the exception of that night against Kiev and that, even that cup final, we're basically we're having to climb and scrape our way all the way to it. When Celtic take the lead, it's a bad defence. What I will say about the aerial thing is that I will at least give credit that Rangers noticed this as well, because see, the following season, Rangers dominated every team in the air. The following season, we had Butcher, we had Gough, we had Drinkle. Rangers, John Brown. Rangers won 90% of every aerial duel, and teams were terrified against us. but we're all over the shop. Watching these back now, even just brief highlights or whatever, but it's flooding a lot of memories that Roberts going wasn't maybe just quite the big. No. It was all due to a fallout that we maybe that we maybe anticipated. His form this season is just. I'll be honest, I always thought of Graham Roberts as a midfielder. When he was in England, he played in central midfield, as a holder. He'll go to Chelsea and he'll play that role. I didn't really like him as a centre.
He wasn't the quickest either, David, wasn't he?
No. He was better. He was better, Alan, sitting in front of a back four.
Aye, and doing that.
Doing your tackles and giving it to a player. At Spurs, his job was to do that for Glenn Hoddle, because Glenn Hoddle's not going to put a tackle in ever.
It's funny, David, you mentioned you mentioned the aerial thing, right? Graham Roberts is not tall. Richard Gough is not that tall. No, Terry Butcher is 6'4". He is an absolute colossus, and those two as a combination, they're an utter liability. I'm conscious of time, Alan. I presume you were there. Souness, if you remember on the video, 86-87 video, I had that flippant comment. So, Celtic games are important, but I don't mind losing 4 times to Celtic as long as we win the title. 1 point out of 8. And that point was, as we discussed a couple of weeks ago, famous, but a dramatic game in its own way. But, we had to claw back and just about got that. This was an appalling Old Firm record. Your memories of Ibrox at full time that day.
Sorry, Martyn. It would be different if there were a handful of teams that potentially were going to win it. But the thing is, you had to, because Celtic, ultimately was between us and Celtic, really.
Yeah, the league arithmetic just does not allow for 4 defeats against Celtic and still winning the title. But can you remember much about Ibrox after that? Because that is after the glory of the season before and all of that and taking that title back, that must have been pretty grey.
It was absolutely horrible, and I do remember the game. I know we're conscious at time as well, but I remember the Scott Nisbet one you never mentioned, but there was the ball. I think Woods was kind of asking him to leave it, never heard. He kind of puts his head up, and it was that kind of shambles. Or the Bartram scoring, the usual. His celebration, but as you say, losing it. But I think because some of the guys I had then I had moved in around about that week to a department where there was, I think it was administration, when there's a lot of Celtic fans in there, and I think they were really beginning to believe, it's our centenary year and so on. So the fact that we had been beaten at that one, you just wanted to get to the end of the season. I know it sounds very defeatist, but after that, the way things were going and all the turmoil...
the season's done. Yeah. There's nothing left to play for. Souness Northsmith attended the post-match press conference. This was becoming something of a trend, by the way.
That's right.
And now that the season was effectively over, the internal Ibrox pressure cooker was about to burst once more as the last 7 weeks of the season descended into even deeper levels of chaos. Jan Bartram. First impressions, quite a mild-mannered pro, an eye for goal as we saw, maybe not cut out for the physical nature of the Scottish game, but no one would have imagined or could have imagined the repercussions of his trip to Italy in the midweek following that Old Firm game. It's an Olympic warm-up game for Denmark, and he talked in an open press conference about his experience at Rangers so far, and his story was run by the Danish daily newspaper under the headline, "My Boss is a Hooligan." This wasn't 80s tabloid clickbait or an 80s version of that. His account was maybe naive, certainly ill-advised. I think he said he struggled to sleep later that night, but it was open, both in opinion and in fact. It wasn't a mistranslation. I didn't go to Scotland to risk breaking other people's legs. I'm very much against that style. Souness wants us to be hard when we're in trouble. He is a bastard. I will not follow orders and deliberately kick people. He should have been shown the red card against Stoya. He likes to get the ball and slaughter other players, and I don't think I can learn this type of play. I like to see beautiful things in the game, so I'm prepared to be fired. I'm glad to be back amongst my Danish countrymen so I can play real football again. Souness behaves like a madman. When we lose, he's threatened to hit a journalist so hard that he wouldn't get up again. Now, he denied it all. despite 3 separate Danish sources. Not a country known for its sensationalist media, confirming it all to be true. And then he and Souness had to go on television to provide this kind of united, well-rehearsed front. I'm not sure anyone would particularly buy that. But again, Alan, each passing month of this season, we're just
crazy. It's just, as you say, it was. Yeah. And the irony as well is they go on TV, don't they, to talk about it?
Yeah.
Was there not talk as well about Souness kicking TV screens? Yeah. And but it's like, what next? Do you know what I mean? All of this season, we'll obviously get onto the court stuff as well, but it's just like, fucking, what next?
Yeah, it is a case of what next, yeah.
It's the shit that comes at you when you're having a season like that. What I will say is he wasn't the only player in that era that thought that whatever he said back home doesn't make it back to...
I don't know. As I said, he couldn't sleep that night, so I'm pretty sure once he had a few hours to think about it, maybe that's...
I mean, it was... look, if he didn't like the style of play, that is absolutely fine. Ask for a move. Don't, give it that ball. Because, I mean, it's not like... And it's not like back then you were stuck at a club. Jesus, you might even really like it, and Souness would decide he didn't fancy and let you go. I was a big Stuart Monroe fan, and I didn't see what this guy had that Stuart Monroe didn't, other than being from Denmark.
Exactly,
to be honest. And I think Souness was guilty of this a few times, of buying guys. He just, for some reason, didn't matter what Monroe did. He was never going to be his type of player. Or rather, he was never going to be his player. And I think that was the problem. I think that's what McCoy suffered from as well. That, you're not mine. And that caused a problem. I don't think there's any doubt, incidentally, that Souness this season is all over the place, emotionally. He's finding it difficult. He's finding it difficult, I think, balancing being a player and a manager. And also, there's a rage at the dying of the light, because this storied, incredible football career is coming to an end. And you've sort of acknowledged that with becoming a manager, but it must be difficult for an elite athlete to realise that his body's not doing what he's telling it to do anymore. Yeah. And especially at a time when his team aren't doing it, and he's got to be going about and screaming and ball. And again, it was that mentality of that era. Although it is interesting because, the managers he played under at Liverpool, Joe Fagan, Bob Paisley, they were not screamers. No. They were not ranters and ravers. There's a great story about Liverpool when they get knocked out the FA Cup by Brighton. They stop on the way home at a chippy, and as they all walk back on, Bob Paisley says, "Right, lads, we're not going to play like that again, are we?" And they're like, "No, boss," and they go on and win the league. I think this is a man who is, a tempest at the best of times, and he's having difficulty. We've heard from managers who were great players who they go in and they say that it affects them even more. Mm-hmm. Even if they were huge competitors, it affects them even more as a manager because they get the solo responsibility rather than collective, and he's all over the shop. But if Jan Bartram was that unhappy, keep your mouth shut and go and speak to your agent.
There's also due diligence as well. When Rangers were looking who to sign as well, is the guy going to be up for the physical type? Obviously, they haven't done that one. And I think the other one too was, as you said, with Graham Souness and that ego again. He's went through his life being this guy that everybody's going to look at him, I'm going to have him, and went, come on then. And he's handled everything, and he's battered away, and he's done it as a top-class player. He's come up to Scotland as well, and they're going, do you think so? And we've won the league. And as you say, suddenly it looks as if, oh shit, things aren't going. And his natural way it's not to go away and hide, isn't it?
It's to be out there and up front. And another, to Talon's point about due diligence, Denmark were incredibly trendy at this time.
Yeah, after 84-86.
After 84-86, right? But Manchester United had come across the exact same problem. They signed a guy called Johnny Sivebæk, who was a very talented player, actually, a Danish international for many years, and would go on to have a really good career in Serie A. And he said about playing in England, he goes, I was terrified. He said, because basically it was a fight, and you'd go out and there'd be guys elbowing you, and you'd say to the referee, you saw that, and he'd be like, play on, it's a man's game. The referee's telling him that. And I think Rangers, that was exactly the same. And I think there needs to be a two-way thing. I think there needs to be do you think you can play in this crazy league or this crazy country, taking the UK as a whole? But it was ridiculous. And look, Souness' face in that in that interview, he might as well have had a T-shirt saying, "As soon as this is over, I would like to rip his eyes out." On he just simmering rage.
On the park, Rangers were fortunate to beat Dundee 3-2 at Dens Park, a late Durrant penalty. But were beaten 2-1 at home by Hearts. They were also chasing second place, despite being 1-up through Bartram, funnily enough. And then, as the Glasgow Garden Festival bloomed into life on Easter weekend, there was the next embarrassment of losing 3-2 away to already relegated Martyn. Even with an Ian Ferguson scissor kick. Promise of things to come, perhaps. It was just a performance typical of a tired season. Roberts going off injured, even Chris Woods looking suspect for 2 of those Martyn goals. Souness was traditionally cut, but fair about the situation. He said last year I spent a lot of money on the defence and they won us the Premier League Championship. This year they have lost us the title. He didn't place the entire blame on the loss of Butcher. We have internationalists at the back and shouldn't have to rely on one man. The attitude will need to change and some of the players will need to remember that they're playing for Rangers. 12th of April was seen outside of the football stadium, and indeed Glasgow Sheriff Court, the trial of the Old Firm 4 began. A lot of the time spent on the behaviour of the crowd rather than the kind of handbags incident that we discussed the last time the three of us were round these microphones. You see them at football grounds up and down the country. It looked to be heading to a common sense outcome. Frank McAvenny, who started the whole thing, don't forget, was found not guilty. Graham Roberts was not proven, and Terry Butcher was feeling quite confident and relieved when it was his turn to take to the stand and listen to Sheriff Archibald Mackay. Guilty. I couldn't believe what I'd heard. I didn't hear how much I was fined. I was so stunned. It was Butcher's decision to get involved, not to protect Woods, but to deliver a deliberate, violent push that could reasonably have been expected to upset other Celtic players and their supporters. That led to that judgment. Disregarding completely the reality of the football field and goalkeeping self-preservation, Chris Woods was also found guilty of jabbing McAvenny sharply on the chin with his forearm. It was an assault which constituted a breach of the peace. The potential consequences of pitch invasions, riots were at the forefront of the judgment, but both the players of the club felt it was ridiculously harsh when far worse physical acts have been seen in Old Firm games. The next question, I guess, was what happens next? Because Graham Souness was genuinely flat about his English players saying, "Forget this, we're going home. Enough's enough." David Holmes had also said to the three of them, if you decided that you've had your fill, we won't stand in your way, we get it. But Butcher said immediately, "No, I won't be forced away. It's a sick joke." Chris Woods did have a think about the impact in his England career, but decided to stay, and Robert said he wouldn't be going anywhere. But in a somewhat fitting coda to this tempestuous season, it wouldn't be a choice that would be in his control. Shall we go then, gentlemen, to the final Ibrox match of the season against Aberdeen? Graham Souness' programme notes, "Frankly, I hope I never have to go through another season like it." Durrant had been dropped for the final few games, again in a nightclub scuffle, which Souness was not happy with. 1-0 defeat, typically. Brian Irvine goal, another defensive failure to deal with a long ball. Just something that Rangers have been guilty of all season. And what people don't really realise, it was Walter Smith that started the dressing room inquiry. He had a go at Roberts for his positioning, and Roberts refused to accept any of the blame when it was clear to everyone in the dressing room that he'd been fault, Smith said. It wasn't a goal when you watched it back. There's not an obvious culprit, more just a kind of general organisational deficiency, but Roberts, centre-half and captain, would have been expected to shoulder that responsibility. And just as he was disputing his culpability, in came Souness and immediately backed his assistant. Some strong words, and Roberts' line was, "Well, if that's the way you feel about it, you better sell me." A direct challenge to Souness' authority as manager, and there was no way he was going to back down. Told him to consider it done. Now, Souness has spoken about this before. He said, look, there was another way to handle it. Take him out of the dressing room quietly, give him the opportunity to apologise in front of the squad, and, fine, but that would have needed a different Souness, a more mature Souness, one that wasn't still kicking every ball. And that was that. I mean, Roberts, cult hero. I think what these 4 shows in this season have done is exactly what you said, David. They've helped understand that this was almost an inevitable path to this moment, because Roberts just wasn't working on the pitch. Him and Goff didn't go on. I think we spoke about it in other shows. Goff was, I think, a bit miffed that he'd come as Spurs captain, and Souness, when Butcher was injured, didn't make him captain because he was frightened he would lose Roberts if he didn't. So they just didn't get on. But there was also a concern about Roberts getting maybe a bit too big for his boots. He was a huge cult hero with the support. The support loved him. We'll get to the Falkirk game in a minute, the final game of the season at Brockville. But he was massive. Now, Souness has probably got an issue with this, and we'll get to McCoist in a few weeks. That players being bigger than Graham Souness is a problem. But he was becoming a bit too big in the dressing room. His attitude towards younger players was being reported back to Souness as being really not on, and it just wasn't good for harmony. And eventually, of course, he would go. That was his last ever game for Rangers. And as we will see, the harmony within that dressing room, with the odd moment, was far better for it. But this was seismic, David.
Huge. And hands up as being absolutely terrified. First of all, by what you said about the English players maybe wanting to go, because it was a huge focus in the media after that shambles of a decision. And then this happens. And I just couldn't believe that it would happen, that he would go. I thought, well, he would just say sorry, I would, and everything will be all right. But it was very difficult because Souness was everybody's hero, but so was Graham Roberts. And I didn't know at the time about the rest of it. And I can't help but feel, Martyn, had he been sensational that season, that Souness wouldn't have had, even that version of Souness, that he wouldn't have handled it differently. I can't believe that to be the case. But Goff was who Souness planned to and would turn out to be the guy who the next 10 years were about. He'd wanted him from the start. He'd chased him. He'd got him. That's there's only going to be one winner type situation. And again, I've worked with Graham Roberts a few times when I was at the RSD. He's a great guy. He is. He's very brash, confident. Very centre of attention. Like
Rangers needed
party kind of thing.
Rangers needed when he came in.
When he came in, absolutely. But I can see why maybe for other people that might grate a little, especially when egos are involved. Especially when Roberts could legitimately think, here, I'm the man here, because the fans were telling him he was the man there, especially with Butcher out. The fans thought he was the man. So I can understand it, but again, I think that if things were going well, you couldn't have a better guy about the place, because he is, he's a very intelligent guy. Graham Roberts, very funny, but he is very much, he'll say himself that he's a guy that could start a fight in an empty room if he's not happy about something. That he did a poor season. They all had, but he did a poor season. And if you've just spent £1 million, what was it, £1 million, £1.5 for Richard Goff?
1.2,
yeah, 1.2, right? When you've spent that, he's going to stay. He's going to be the one that you work on. It's not going to be him that leaves. But how did we feel about it? Gutted. I remember fraught conversations at school. I remember asking grown-ups, nothing's true until a grown-up. They can just, no, it's not happening, and you take that to the bank. But there was a sense of things fall apart. And this season it felt like 10 months of things falling apart, and this just seemed to cap it all off. I would have been interested had this fallout not happened, and then the way Roberts handles it ensures, when he plays up to the crowd you're about to talk about, that ensures that he's gone soon. It's not going to put up with it. I think had Chelsea wandered in with a $500,000 bid in the summer anyway, I think he might have gone for it. Butcher on the way back.
Yeah.
But he's not going to play, and this was not an era of squads. right? You didn't have three brilliant centre backs. That just wasn't the done thing at all. It just wasn't considered. Butcher's coming back. He's a captain. He's a leader. He's going to play. Goff's cost over $1 million. He's going to play. Where does Roberts fits in? And then there is.
Yeah, he couldn't. He couldn't play in that front one, David. You know, you talked about the kind of sitting in front because you've got the likes of Derek Ferguson's and so on. So you've got others that more capable.
Well, Ray Wilkins is there now.
Ray's there. The issue maybe is Goff was not bought as a centre half. Goff's a right back. And you already have Roberts and Butcher, or Roberts can play at right back. I mean, so it's not a case of maybe just having three centre halves there, and they can't play anywhere else. Because I think you're right, David. In 1988, three centre halves of that quality and with those transfer fees is very unlikely. But there was some flexibility. They just couldn't play together themselves. And you make the point about chemistry, and we ignore it so often as football fans, but maybe it's a football manager thing or fantasy football or whatever. Roberts and Goff are good, very good, decorated footballers, but they just couldn't make it work. Couldn't speak to each other, and again, I think both wanted to be the boss, and well, that can't work.
And it can't work in a centre half partnership. No, it can't. Somebody needs to be the one, and somebody needs to be the sweeper. I think as well that you know, in a situation like that Souness is a big one on responsibility in terms of as players. We hear it now in his punditry every week about responsibility. I think your captain, especially in that era, trying to get himself away from blame on something is crossing a line to that era, Souness. I really do. I think that there's a code he has that breaches. And I think the fact that it came from someone like Roberts, who he respected as a fellow hard, you know, honest top pro, I think that the fact that not only are you not accepting the responsibility, that you're actually trying to kind of shift it onto other people. I just think that though these are fraught tempers with huge personalities, and it can't stay. I can also think that he's maybe now looking at his dressing room, Martyn, and he goes, I've got Butcher, he's good pro, I've got Goff, he's a good pro, I've got Ray Wilkins. I've got my leaders. I don't need you anymore. And
he was getting complaints for the young ones as well, David. So that's probably fed into him as well.
That ties into it. It's a case of, look, I've got to change something because there's no cohesion here at all. Yeah. There's none. There really isn't in this Rangers team. When we're getting wins, it's by individual brilliance. Yeah. Really, we've got to do something to try and make this group of individuals into a team. And if you feel anybody in that squad is preventing you from doing that, then you're going to make the decision. For me, this is clearly, if it hadn't happened this game, Martyn, it would have happened over the summer. Something would have happened at training. I think that's probably right.
Goff certainly talks about being quite happy about it, and the fact that the dressing room harmony changes instantly, and we'll come to that obviously in later weeks. Butcher, bless him, he was talking about getting back for the European Cup semi-final. In fact, he'd initially talked about being back for the second leg of the quarter, which didn't happen. He was nearly playing at the end, and he was kind of nearly brought back. There was a lot of chat that he would come back in.
Setback.
But it was felt that the bone was still too weak. And certainly he could forget England in West Germany. I think it's fair to say they missed him badly. But it meant that he would be back properly for the next season. Alan, final game of the season, a 5-0 win against Falkirk at Brockville. I don't know if you were there that day. Graham Roberts was there that day as a paying punter. Lots of Robbo Must Stay chants. There was a Robbo Must Stay banner. Both Souness, Smith and Holmes were given a very hard time in the stands that day. Can you remember that? Were you there?
Yeah, I was there. Yeah, I remember it. I must admit, when I heard it, obviously the chants, and as you say, the banner too, it was like obviously I'm old school, Martyn, as you guys keep telling me, but as much as I really liked, Robertson, what he had done when he came, it was like you don't do that. You don't go against the club. You don't go against the manager. You don't do those things in public. So I just had a feeling that there was either going to have to be one hang of an apology from him, or he was toast, really. Do you know? I didn't, because I don't think there was any way that, unless something happened behind the scenes, but I don't think there was any way that realistically we could then have kept him. I didn't know about the unsettling, things behind the scenes and so on. But you don't do that, go against the club or go against the Rangers manager and, the assistant and so on. So obviously we played well, you win, but it's like, what do you do? Everything's gone. But then I think it was 5-0 or something, pretty easy stuff. But the atmosphere at that one, it was pretty strange. I think, sorry, David.
That's a direct challenge.
Because
he's clearly told not to. And we cannot talk about this bomb squad thing of you become a known person. It was prevalent in football back then. I mean, it still happens now, but within the bounds of employment law. But back then, if a manager didn't take to you, I mean, they would make your life a living hell because they wanted you to move. So they would.
He'd be playing in the reserves.
Training with the kids.
He would be training with the kids.
You'd be banned. Yeah. You'd be training with the kids. You'd be, they would humiliate you. They would.
Did they put him up to the Highlands or something?
They did, yeah. They did humiliate him,
sent him up to the Highlands by youth squad. The whole idea is to, but this is as bad as it is, folks. I'm glad we've moved on. It's standard practice then. It's standard operating procedure. He'll have seen it done at other clubs and to other players, but he has been told you're not coming to fault. You've not to be with the first team, and he turns up to sit with the supporters. That's clearly, look, they all love me. It's to get some affirmation for their fans, and it's to say to Souness, you better think about what you're about to do, because look at this. Look, they all think I'm amazing. That, to me, if there was any way back, it was done then. I would come down on Souness' side there 100%. I don't think it's an overreaction, because it's an absolutely shocking and very egotistical thing to do. And I'm sure Roberts kind of regrets it now, but what you're doing there is you're turning up and you're saying to Souness and to the world, they love me. Are you sure you want to do this? I'm super popular with this mob. And Souness then has to. He's got no. Because you can't allow a player, because what you're then saying is you're allowing a player to win an argument with you by saying, I'll go at the fans, I'll go over your head. And then Souness, right from the start, had made it clear that if the fans thought one thing and he thought another, he would go with what he thought. Yeah. So he's been through a few battles already with it. Why do we keep passing the ball back? We'll get it in the effing box. Yeah, that to me is pretty unforgivable what Roberts did. And you're right, he was fined and he was sent up to the Highlands because with the kids the next day.
The thing was, he goes to Chelsea, but he doesn't go to Chelsea in June. It's not a quick, deal. This goes right to the kind of there is no wire as such because there's no transfer window, but it's well into the summer before this is done. So he doesn't travel with Rangers. He did, but it was made very obvious that wasn't going to happen. One more question is for Alan, because you and I have discussed this, David, and I appreciate that slightly older perspective on this question. I don't want to get into the start of 88-89 because we'll do that next week, but you guys won't be on that show. It's a question that fascinates me with Rangers fans, and I ask anyone of that vintage, Alan, how worried were you at the end of that season? Celtic go on and they won the double in the last minute again. It's been a pretty chaotic, pretty disastrous season compared to the last one. Is there a fear that this Souness guy is a flash in the pan? Comes in, does the biz first year, the Messiah, but now he can hardly buy a win. Everything he touches just seems to be a total mess. He seems completely out of control. You've got a cult hero handing in a transfer request early in the season. You've now got one, effectively binned. Things seem at this moment in time that we're stopping at to be in a downward spiral. Can you remember the kind of level of morale within the Bradley household in the summer of '88?
Well, you're talking about the probably head of the what can I say, the glass half empty loyal. So you guys know what I'm like anyway. No, but realistic.
Reverend I am Allen.
That's right. I actually make Jolly sound a wee bit happier. But anyway, no, but with this one, when you think of where we'd came from, I don't know, the 8 or the 9 years where we were also Rans, we weren't even getting, in the kind of top couple. So we had obviously won it. We just had this absolute horror of a shit show. Celtic obviously had the momentum and they ended up doing this double. But the actual squad, with Ian Ferguson coming in, who was one of my favourites, the likes of Mark Walters, Wilkins and so on, a big butcher was going to be coming back. I wasn't actually that, and I thought we would potentially strengthen a wee bit in the summer. So although I was disappointed, but I just wanted to get on to the following season. In terms of Graham Souness, I don't know whether I'd focused. This has actually been really good for me, kind of looking at his behaviours and how he acted and so on. But it was more really around the kind of side. And I was really prepared to give it another go. I think if we hadn't have been successful kind of following that, then I think there'd be panic stations. But at this point in time, as I say, if you think about it, even 3 or 4 years prior to that, we weren't even looking at, potentially going to win the league, obviously throwing it at the end. We'd won a league. We had done no bad in terms of Europe again, the European Cup, and with the kind of Butcher, McCoy stuff and so on, we could have. So, no, I wasn't, there certainly wasn't panic, and it was just a case of, for God's sake, let's just get the season, let's get to the next one and start and move on.
Well, Robert's little demonstration at Brockville didn't matter. It was never going to matter. Walter Smith was in full support of the Graham Souness' decision. He wrote, managers cannot afford to walk away from difficult or unpopular judgments. Often things happen away from the public gaze which determine the direction you take. But if you bottle a tough disciplinary matter, then you can lose all the players, not just the one who brought the trouble to a head. Roberts would eventually leave to Chelsea, and at a profit, of course, for £475,000. Gentlemen, we will leave it there. We have got through a difficult season. It might be December until we're in a similar kind of situation, but thank you, Alan.
Thank you. I sort of enjoyed that, Martyn. I think certainly enjoyed the first part of the season with some of the games we had, but again, no, it's really good going through it and trying to analyse, what actually happened and trying to put things into perspective. So thanks, mate.
Thank you for your help in doing that. David, thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me. It was some tough memories, tough season. As I said, it stands out in that era as just a slog, just a complete slog. Souness wasn't the only one who at the end of it hoped he'd never go through a season like that again.
The Roberts debacle was probably a pertinent way in which to bring this very difficult season to a close. The title had been handed over. Rangers could only finish third behind Hearts and Celtic, and another European opportunity passed up a little too easily in a year that seriously lacked order and professionalism. Celtic would produce yet another late escape, as I said, to come back from behind to win the Scottish Cup against Dundee United, and in doing so, secure a double in their centenary year. It was a tough summer for everyone who had Rangers at heart. But the mistakes of inactivity were learned, and instead the summer of '88 proved to be the start of something very special, a period of real dominance, unparalleled in the history of the club. The physical point had now been proven. By now Rangers were really only fighting themselves. It was now time to focus on the football, and for Souness to build a classier side that couldn't be touched by any other team in the land. The signings of Wilkins and Walters were the first creative players that he'd brought through the door, and there would be more. Yeah, the signing of John Brown would be paralleled in future by Spackman and Terry Hurlock. Souness was never going to give up that particular principle entirely, but they would be surrounded by more and more players of genuine inventive talent. And Souness himself, for so many years the perfect blend of steel and silk, would now have to let go. Although a couple of years older, Kenny Dalglish could only do both jobs to full capacity for one season before happily becoming a bit part cameo at Anfield. Souness played 30 games in the 87-88. He'd play 11 more for Rangers in the next 2 seasons before hanging up the boots for good. At a club of this size, a player-manager can only ever be a short-term option, and more detachment would ultimately lead to better control. The complacency that he'd shown in that 86-87 video had now been well and truly banished. Although technically true, Rangers fans would always favour a title without an Old Firm victory over 4 great games and no trophy at all. It completely ignored the reality of league arithmetic. beating Celtic and beating them often was going to be key to winning the flag. And ultimately that final argument with Roberts after a season full of recrimination perhaps drew a line in the sand. Is this how it's going to be? An emotional Graham Souness challenged these players that afternoon after the Aberdeen defeat. We win one, they win one, we win one, they win one, because I'm not fucking interested in that. As it would turn out, neither were they. Until next time, bye for now.